Midnight, August 2nd, 1944. A solitary American aircraft circled above central Serbia, a region under Nazi German occupation. Below, in a mountain meadow near the village of Pranjani, a signal fire blazed. The pilot spotted the flame, adjusted his course, and made his approach. Three figures leaped into the darkness. Their parachutes billowed open before vanishing into the forest canopy. Among them was 29-year-old Captain George Musulin, a Serbian-American born in New York and raised in Pennsylvania. He had played college football for the University of Pittsburgh's 1937 national championship team before going pro, suiting up for Chicago, St. Louis, and Pittsburgh. A large, rugged man, fluent in Serbian, Musulin served with the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, America's wartime intelligence agency and the precursor to the CIA. With him were Master Sergeant Michael Rajacic, a fellow Serbian-American and radio operator skilled in Morse code and shortwave transmitters, and 21-year-old specialist Arthur Jibilian, known to everyone as Jibby, a Lebanese-American from Ohio and communications expert. Jibilian didn't speak Serbian, but that didn't matter. His critical role was maintaining radio contact with Allied headquarters in Bari, Italy, 300 miles across the Adriatic Sea. The trio landed hard on rough terrain, quickly gathering their equipment: parachutes, radio gear, weapons, and medical supplies. Within minutes, armed figures emerged from the woods, bearded men in tattered uniforms, Chetnik guerrilla fighters loyal to General Draža Mihailović. The Americans were escorted to a farmhouse where 51-year-old Mihailović awaited them. Gray-bearded with sharp, piercing eyes, Mihailović was a former Royal Yugoslav Army colonel who had led Chetnik resistance forces against the Germans since Yugoslavia's fall in 1941. For 3 years, his men had clung to pockets of rural Serbia, while the Germans controlled the cities, roads, and rail lines. Through an interpreter, Mihailović delivered a reassuring message. "Your men are safe, all of them. We have done everything possible." Musulin glanced around the room, asking, "How many?" 250, maybe more," came the reply. "Scattered across the hills. We are gathering them here." These were American airmen shot down over Yugoslavia, rescued by Serbian peasants and Chetnik fighters, hidden from German patrols for weeks, some even months, waiting desperately for extraction and a chance to go home. This was Operation Halyard, the largest rescue of Allied airmen in World War II history, and it nearly never happened. 6 weeks earlier, in late June 1944, at 15th Air Force Headquarters in Bari, Italy, Lieutenant Colonel George Kaig pored over intelligence reports. For months, American bombers had been targeting Romania's Ploiești oil fields, Hitler's primary fuel source. The raids had devastated Nazi petroleum production, but the cost was catastrophic. The 1,500-mile round trip from Italy took the bombers over German-occupied Yugoslavia, a region teeming with anti-aircraft batteries and Luftwaffe fighters. Dozens of American bombers were shot down every week. B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses, each carrying a 10-man crew of pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and engineers. When a plane went down, survivors bailed out. If they survived the jump, if their parachutes opened, if they weren't gunned down during descent, they landed in enemy territory. More often than not, the Germans captured them within hours, sending them to prisoner of war camps like Stalag Luft 3 or Stalag 17B if they were lucky. The unlucky ones were turned over to the Gestapo or SS by local collaborators and executed on the spot, reprisals for the bombing of German cities. But intelligence was picking up coded messages from occupied Yugoslavia. American airmen were being hidden by local Serbs, dozens of them, possibly more, protected by Mihailović's Chetnik forces. The problem was political. Britain had initially supported Mihailović early in the war, sending liaison officers, weapons, and supplies. But by 1944, British policy had shifted. Winston Churchill now backed Josip Broz Tito, a Croatian communist partisan leader trained in Moscow. The British believed Tito was fighting the Germans more aggressively than Mihailović. Churchill cut off support to the Chetniks, ordered British missions withdrawn, and pressured the United States to follow suit. Washington complied. President Roosevelt trusted Churchill's judgment on Balkan affairs. American liaison officers were pulled from Mihailović's territory in May 1944, leaving the general isolated, no Allied support, No weapons, no recognition, only his men and the Serbian peasants who stood with him. Yet the downed American airmen remained, hidden in Serbian villages, waiting for rescue. The 15th Air Force couldn't abandon them. Someone had to go in, organize an evacuation, and risk everything. George Musulin volunteered. Musulin had been to Yugoslavia before, in October 1943, when he parachuted in with an American mission to Mihailović's headquarters. He spent months with the Chetniks, witnessing firsthand how they treated Allied airmen with respect, protection, and generosity. Serbian villagers shared scarce food, hid airmen in barns, cellars, and attics, and risked execution if discovered. Entire villages could be burned, men shot, women and children deported to labor camps. Musulin had returned to Italy in May 1944, escorting 40 rescued airmen evacuated by British aircraft just before Allied missions withdrew. In Bari, he filed detailed reports, debriefings, and recommendations, telling his superiors the truth. Mihailović was still rescuing and protecting Americans, waiting for Allied support that would never come. "We need to get those men out," Musulin argued. "Mihailović's people are risking everything. The Germans know Americans are being hidden here. They're increasing patrols, conducting sweeps. It's only a matter of time before they find them." His commanders agreed, but the British opposed the operation. It was too politically sensitive. Supporting Mihailović would anger Tito and complicate Allied relations with Yugoslav partisans. The Americans needed British cooperation, aircraft, and logistical support in Italy. Frustrated, Musulin bypassed the chain of command and went directly to OSS Director General William Wild Bill Donovan, laying out the crisis. 250 American airmen trapped behind enemy lines, abandoned by the Allies due to politics. Men who would die because of bureaucracy. Donovan took the case to President Roosevelt, explaining the situation. American boys shot down over Europe, rescued by Serbian peasants, hidden from the Germans, waiting for their country to save them. "Politics be damned," Roosevelt declared. He approved the mission and ordered British cooperation. Churchill's government reluctantly agreed. Operation Halyard was authorized, but the clock was ticking. German intelligence was already aware that Allied airmen were in Serbia. They increased patrols, offered rewards for information, and threatened reprisals against villages suspected of hiding Americans. Meanwhile, Tito's communist partisans were closing in on Mihailović's territory, a civil war within the larger conflict. Tito sought to eliminate his rivals before Germany's collapse. If the partisans reached Pranjani before the evacuation, the airmen would become hostages, bargaining chips in Yugoslavia's brutal internal struggle. Musulin assembled his team, Rajacic and Jibilian, both volunteers who understood the risks. Their mission: parachute into occupied Serbia, link up with Mihailović, organize the airmen, build a makeshift airstrip, coordinate evacuation flights with the 15th Air Force, all while evading German patrols and partisan forces and keeping 250 scared, exhausted, and injured American airmen alive and hidden. The first 3 attempts failed. On July 15, 1944, an aircraft malfunction forced the mission to abort. On July 20th, thick clouds over the Balkans obscured visibility, and the plane turned back. On July 28th, a navigation error led to the wrong coordinates. The pilot couldn't find the signal fire, circled for an hour, and returned to Italy rather than jump blind. Musulin was furious. Every day increased the risk. More time for the Germans to find the airmen. More time for morale to crumble among the men waiting in the mountains. Finally, on August 2nd, 1944, conditions were perfect. Clear skies, accurate navigation, and a signal fire visible for miles. At midnight, Musulin, Rajacic, and Jibilian jumped, landed safely, made contact with the Chetniks within minutes, and reached Mihailović's headquarters by dawn. The general greeted them with relief. "Your men are ready. We have been waiting." Musulin surveyed the situation. More than 250 airmen were gathered, with more arriving steadily. Some had walked in on their own after being shot down. Others were escorted by Chetnik fighters. Serbian villagers had risked everything to transport the Americans through German checkpoints, disguising them as peasants, hiding them in wagons under hay and potatoes, and guiding them through forests under cover of night. The airmen were exhausted and terrified, many injured from bailouts and crash landings, burns, broken bones, shrapnel wounds. Chetnik medics did their best with limited supplies, while Serbian families shared their meager food stores: bread, goat milk, and rakia, the potent local plum brandy. It boosted morale, but time was running out. A German garrison was stationed just 20 miles southeast in Kraljevo, along with a Luftwaffe airfield housing fighter planes and reconnaissance aircraft. If the Germans spotted the evacuation, they would scramble fighters to strafe the airstrip and attack the transport planes, dooming everyone. Another massive obstacle loomed: the terrain. Central Serbia was mountainous and heavily forested, with no flat ground suitable for landing aircraft. Transport planes needed at least 600 yards of clear, level runway, preferably more. The area around Pranjani had nothing of the sort. Mihailović's solution was both ingenious and desperate. Build a runway by hand, using peasants armed with axes, shovels, and oxen. They would clear trees, level the ground, and compact the earth to create a functional airstrip in the middle of enemy-occupied wilderness, without heavy equipment, engineers, or time. "Can it be done?" Musulin asked. Mihailović smiled. "It will be done. My people have survived worse." Hundreds of Serbian villagers answered the call: men, women, and children, cutting trees, pulling stumps, hauling rocks, smoothing dirt, and compacting the ground to build an airstrip from scratch. They worked at night, with shielded lanterns and hushed voices to avoid detection. When German planes flew overhead during the day, the villagers herded livestock onto the unfinished airstrip, making it look like an ordinary pasture: cows grazing, sheep wandering, farmers tending fields. Nothing to arouse suspicion. Musulin watched the progress, impressed yet anxious. The runway was nearly ready, but coordinating with Italy was fraught with challenges: unreliable radio communication, unpredictable weather, constant German air patrols, and a steady stream of new airmen arriving. By this point, more than 250 airmen were scattered across nearby villages, each with harrowing stories. First Lieutenant Richard Fellman, a B-24 bombardier shot down in April 1944, had been injured during his bailout. Rescued by Serbian peasants, he spent 2 months hidden in a barn. Second Lieutenant Nick Petrovic, a B-17 tail gunner and Serbian-American from Chicago, used his language skills to translate for other airmen. Staff Sergeant Tony Orsini, a radio operator from New York with a thick Brooklyn accent, had survived a flak hit that disabled his plane. Their stories were remarkably similar: flying bombing missions to Ploiești, being hit by anti-aircraft fire, bailing out into the mountains, and fearing capture or death until Serbian villagers appeared. Old men, women, and children offered help, food and shelter, despite the mortal risk. One airman landed in a field near the village of Topola. A Serbian farmer found him, took him home, fed him, and hid him in a cellar. The farmer's wife gave him civilian clothes, and their daughter brought him water and bread daily, all while the family had barely enough for themselves. Another airman, severely burned, was carried 20 miles through the mountains by Chetnik fighters to a Serbian doctor. The physician treated him without anesthesia or proper medical supplies, using homemade bandages, rakia for disinfection, and prayers for healing. The generosity was overwhelming. Serbia was under brutal occupation, food was scarce, resources depleted, and the punishment for aiding the Allies was death. Entire families could be killed, villages destroyed. Yet thousands of Serbs risked everything to save Americans they had never met. Musulin understood the stakes all too well. Every passing day heightened the risk of discovery. If the Germans uncovered the operation before the evacuation could begin, 500 lives would be forfeit. Americans, Serbs, Chetniks, all executed without mercy. He wasted no time radioing an urgent message to 15th Air Force headquarters in Bari. Captain George Cage, who had been monitoring the situation closely, received the update. "Airstrip ready. 250-plus airmen awaiting evacuation. Advise immediately." Cage sprang into action, coordinating with Bomber Command to secure C-47 transport planes, Douglas Sky trains, the workhorses of Allied logistics. Each C-47 could carry 25 passengers, but it required a minimum of 600 yards of smooth, solid runway for takeoff under ideal conditions. Pranjani's hand-built airstrip was anything but ideal. It was unpaved, uneven, ringed by trees, and hemmed in by mountain ridges. Landing would be a harrowing challenge. Taking off with a full load of passengers, over rough dirt, and with limited runway length, bordered on suicidal. But there was no other option. The airmen couldn't march out. The distance to Allied lines was too great. Too many were injured, and German patrols blanketed the region. Tito's partisans were closing in fast, and if they reached Pranjani first, the airmen would be seized as hostages, pawns in Yugoslavia's vicious civil war. After urgent deliberation, the evacuation was scheduled for the night of August 9, 1944, a night operation with 4 C-47s to fly in without lights, land, load the airmen, and depart for Italy as quickly as possible. It was a simple plan, but its execution would be fraught with danger at every turn. Then on August 8th, a new crisis emerged. German reconnaissance flights over the area intensified. Luftwaffe spotter planes circled repeatedly, snapping photos of the countryside. They had either seen something suspicious or sensed that something was amiss. Mihailović, calm under pressure, made an immediate decision. Release the livestock. Cows, sheep, and goats were herded onto the nearly finished airstrip, let loose to graze. When the German planes flew overhead at noon, all they saw was a peaceful pasture, farmers tending to their animals, no signs of military activity. Satisfied, the Luftwaffe aircraft turned away, and the operation was allowed to proceed. As midnight approached, the airmen began to assemble. In total, 255 men gathered, mostly American, with a handful of British and French troops. They had been briefed thoroughly. Stay silent, remain hidden until the last moment. Bring no luggage or souvenirs, only themselves. Serbian families, who had become like kin to many of the airmen, gathered to say their goodbyes. The scene was emotional, tears streaming down faces on both sides. These families had risked everything to feed, shelter, and protect the airmen, treating them as their own sons. An elderly Serbian woman hugged an American pilot tightly, kissing his cheeks before pressing a piece of hard bread into his hand for the journey. He tried to refuse, but she insisted, her voice firm yet gentle. Take it. You will need it. A young Serbian girl, no older than 10, handed her scarf to a bombardier, speaking in halting English. Remember us. He nodded, clutching the scarf tightly, promising he would never forget. These small, heartfelt gestures would stay with the airmen for the rest of their lives, tangible reminders of the kindness they had found in the darkest of circumstances. At 1:30 on August 9th, the distant hum of aircraft engines cut through the silence, growing louder by the second. 4 C-47s approached from the south, flying completely blacked out, navigating by starlight and the radio beacon transmitted by Arthur Jibilian. Jibilian sent the final coordinates, guiding the planes in, while Chetnik fighters lit dim signal fires at both ends of the airstrip. Bright enough to mark the landing path, but dim enough to avoid drawing unwanted attention from nearby German outposts. The first C-47 descended steadily, the pilot locking onto the signal fires, adjusting his altitude with precision. He cleared the treetops by a mere 20 feet, the plane's belly nearly brushing the branches as it lined up with the dirt runway. The wheels hit the ground with a jolt, bouncing once before settling into the compacted earth. The engines roared in reverse thrust, kicking up clouds of dust as the plane skidded to a stop at the far end. Without hesitation, the pilot spun the aircraft around, its nose now pointing toward the takeoff path, ready to depart the moment it was loaded. One by one, the remaining 3 C-47s followed suit. Each landing was rough, the unpaved runway sending jolts through the fuselages, but all 4 planes touched down safely. As their engines idled, the side doors slid open and crew members leaped out, their voices urgent but calm. Load up, move fast, stay quiet. The airmen, who had been waiting in tense silence, sprang into action. They ran toward the planes, some limping from injuries, others supporting their wounded comrades. They packed into the C-47s tightly, 25 men per plane, no seats available, sitting on the floor or standing shoulder to shoulder, clinging to cargo straps to steady themselves. There was no time for formality. The only goal was to get on board and get out. Serbian villagers, unable to stay away, swarmed around the aircraft, tears streaming down their faces as they said their final goodbyes. Hugs were quick but heartfelt, shouts of gratitude mixed with sobs. In a spontaneous gesture of thanks, American airmen began unlacing their combat boots. Priceless items in a region where many villagers had no shoes, only tattered felt slippers. Dozens of boots flew through the air, landing in the dirt, and Serbs scrambled to pick them up, gifts of appreciation for the lives they had saved. The scene was chaos, but it was beautiful chaos. Tears and laughter, shouted farewells and quiet promises, Americans waving from the plane doors and Serbs waving back from the ground. For a brief moment, the horror of war faded, replaced by the bond forged between strangers who had risked everything for one another. Then the order came to close the doors. The crew members pushed their way through the crowd, sliding the large doors shut, sealing the airmen inside. The engines roared to life, growing louder as they revved to full power. The first C-47 rolled forward, gathering speed down the bumpy runway. Trees loomed ahead, a wall of darkness that seemed impossible to clear. The pilot pulled back hard on the controls and the plane's nose lifted, barely, its belly scraping against the treetops, branches snapping as it climbed into the night sky. It cleared the trees by mere feet, banking west toward Italy, safe at last. The second plane followed, another heart-stopping close call, its wings narrowly missing the forest canopy. Then the third, then the fourth. All four C-47s climbed into the sky, their taillights fading into the darkness. By dawn, 100 airmen had been evacuated from Pranjani. The first night of Operation Halyard was a success, but the mission was far from over. As the sun rose on August 10th, more C-47s appeared on the horizon. 12 this time, a daylight operation that was far riskier than the night mission. The Germans would have no trouble spotting the planes, but daylight allowed for faster loading and better visibility for the pilots, critical with the ever-growing number of airmen waiting to be rescued. To protect the transports, 50 American P-51 Mustang fighters from the 8th Air Force screamed overhead, flying at low altitude. They peeled off in pairs, strafing German garrisons and outposts in the surrounding area, creating diversions to draw attention away from Pranjani and buy time for the evacuation. The transport planes landed in perfect formation, one after another. No crashes, no accidents. The airmen loaded quickly, guided by Chetnik fighters and OSS personnel, and again, Serbian families gathered to say goodbye. More boots were tossed from the plane doors, more tears shed, more promises to remember. By the end of the day, 241 airmen had been evacuated in just 2 days, over 450 total, but hundreds more still waited in villages across the region, hidden and hopeful. The operation continued in the weeks that followed. 4 more planes on August 12th, 6 on August 15th, 3 on August 18th. Every few days, the evacuation flights returned, each one a race against time. German patrols grew more intense, their searches more thorough. Luftwaffe fighters probed the area constantly, looking for signs of the operation. Tito's partisans, too, were advancing eastward, closing in on Chetnik territory, their goal to eliminate Mihailović's forces before Germany's collapse. The pressure was relentless, but so was the determination of everyone involved. Richard Fellman would carry the memory of his evacuation day, August 27th, with him for the rest of his life. As he prepared to board the C-47, he turned to the Serbian family that had sheltered him for 4 long months, the farmer, his wife, and their young daughter. He struggled to find words to express his gratitude, knowing no phrase could ever repay the risk they had taken to save him. The farmer simply shook his hand, his eyes steady and earnest. "Go home," he said. "Live well, be happy. That is all the thanks we need." Fellman climbed aboard the plane, pressing his forehead against the window as the C-47 rumbled down the runway and lifted off. He watched the Serbian villagers grow smaller below, the hills of Pranjani fading into the distance, and made a silent promise to never forget them. He was not alone in that vow. Every rescued airman carried a similar debt of gratitude, a bond with the Serbian people that would last a lifetime. By September 5, 1944, over 400 airmen had been evacuated from Pranjani, but hundreds more remained scattered across the region, hiding in villages and waiting for their chance to escape. To keep the operation going and reduce the risk of detection, new airstrips were built deeper in Chetnik-held territory, in Kočevo and Bojanic, areas farther from German garrisons, and hopefully out of the partisans' reach. On September 17, the first evacuation flights touched down at the Kočevo airstrip, bringing more airmen to safety and extending the lifeline of Operation Halyard. As the war front shifted and Yugoslavia's civil war grew more ferocious, the leadership of the mission changed too. George Musulin left Serbia on August 29, handing command to Captain Lich, another OSS officer with experience in partisan operations. The transition was seamless. The mission's core purpose, rescuing every last airman, remained unshaken. Lich and his team adapted to the evolving risks, coordinating with Mihailović's forces to move airmen between hiding spots and evacuation points, always one step ahead of the Germans and partisans. The operation continued to evolve, expanding its reach and adjusting its tactics as Allied armies advanced across Europe and Germany's grip on occupied territories weakened. But the danger never subsided. German intelligence was still hunting for the evacuation network, and Tito's partisans were growing more aggressive in their pursuit of Chetnik strongholds. Yet through it all, the collaboration between American agents, Chetnik fighters, and Serbian villagers held firm. Americans refused to abandon their comrades, and Serbs refused to abandon their commitment to honor, even when it cost them everything. The final evacuation flight of Operation Halyard took place on December 27, 1944, when 20 airmen were lifted off from the Bojanic airstrip. As the C-47 climbed into the winter sky, the longest and largest rescue mission of downed Allied airmen in World War II came to an end. When the dust settled, the tally was staggering. 512 Allied personnel had been rescued, 432 Americans and 80 others, including British, French, Italian, and Russian service members. Every single one of them had been pulled from German-occupied Serbia, saved by the courage of Serbian peasants and Chetnik fighters, and brought home alive. The statistics defied belief. 6 months of operations, multiple hand-built airstrips, hundreds of evacuation flights, and not a single aircraft lost to enemy fire. Not one rescuer was killed during the evacuations. It was a miracle of coordination, trust, and sacrifice, one that would later be hailed as one of the greatest unsung victories of the war. Behind this miracle was George Vujnovich, the Serbian-American OSS officer who had masterminded Operation Halyard from his post in Bari, Italy. Born in Pittsburgh to Serbian immigrant parents, Vujnovich had studied at the University of Belgrade before the war. When Germany invaded Yugoslavia in 1941, he fled with his wife Mirana, making a perilous journey through Budapest, Istanbul, Cairo, and Ghana before being recruited by the OSS. Assigned to Yugoslav operations, Vujnovich had learned of the downed airmen in the summer of 1944 and conceived the rescue plan. Vujnovich had personally trained the agents, Musulin, Rajacic, Jibilian, teaching them the small, critical details that would let them blend in. How to tie their shoes the Serbian way, how to speak the local dialect, how to interact with villagers without arousing suspicion. His meticulous planning and unwavering commitment to the mission were the backbone of its success. He had fought bureaucratic red tape, navigated the complex politics of the Balkans, and never lost sight of the goal, bringing American boys home. Richard Fellman, like hundreds of other rescued airmen, never forgot the debt he owed. After returning to the United States, he dedicated himself to telling the story of Serbian heroism, writing letters, making phone calls, testifying before Congress, and sharing the truth with anyone who would listen. He spoke of the families who had risked execution to save strangers, of General Mihailović's Chetniks who had protected American lives at great cost, of the humanity that had prevailed in the midst of war. Fellman was not alone. Rescued airmen formed associations and veteran groups, united by their gratitude and a shared mission to honor their Serbian rescuers, preserve the memory of Operation Halyard, and correct the historical injustice that had befallen Draža Mihailović. For history, manipulated by post-war politics, had betrayed him. When World War II ended, Yugoslavia fell under communist control. Josip Broz Tito, backed by Moscow and Stalin, seized power and set about consolidating his rule. To eliminate all opposition, Tito's regime branded the Chetniks as traitors, collaborators, and war criminals. Lies repeated endlessly until they became accepted as truth in the West. Mihailović went into hiding, but communist forces tracked him down and captured him in March 1946. He was brought to Belgrade for a show trial, accused of treason, war crimes, and collaboration with the Germans. None of the charges were based in fact. Mihailović had fought the Nazis relentlessly, and the 512 Allied airmen he had rescued were living proof of his loyalty to the Allied cause. But truth mattered little in Tito's Yugoslavia. The verdict had been predetermined. The communist regime needed a scapegoat, and Mihailović, the leader of the anti-communist resistance, was the perfect target. The rescued airmen refused to stand by silently. They sent letters to President Truman, to Congress, to the State Department, detailing how Mihailović had saved their lives. They testified that he had protected them, fought the Germans alongside the Allies, and risked everything for them. 51 dozen men, living, breathing evidence of his courage and loyalty. But their pleas fell on deaf ears. Cold War politics dictated the response. Yugoslavia was now a communist state, a key player in the post-war balance of power. Supporting Mihailović would anger Stalin and jeopardize Allied relations with Tito's regime. The American and British governments chose politics over justice, abandoning the man who had saved hundreds of their citizens. They said nothing as the show trial unfolded, as false charges were levied, as Mihailović was denied a fair defense. On July 15, 1946, a Belgrade military court sentenced Mihailović to death. Throughout the trial, he had remained calm, knowing he was the victim of political persecution. His only request was that the world remember his people, the Serbian peasants, villagers, and fighters who had saved Allied lives, who had risked everything, and who had asked for nothing in return. 2 days later, on July 17th at dawn, Mihailović was executed by a firing squad. He was 53 years old. His body was buried in an unmarked grave, its location deliberately concealed. Tito's regime destroyed records, erased evidence, and tried to wipe his memory from history, as if he had never existed, as if his heroism had never happened. But Mihailović had existed, and 512 Allied airmen never let the world forget. For decades, they lobbied governments, petitioned for his exoneration, and refused to let his name be sullied. Finally, in January 1948, President Truman posthumously awarded Mihailović the Legion of Merit, the highest military decoration the United States bestows on foreign nationals, at the chief commander level, for organizing and leading resistance forces against the enemy, for rescuing Allied personnel, and for demonstrating extraordinary courage and loyalty. Yet even this honor was hidden away. Classified as secret for 20 years, the award was kept under wraps to avoid offending Tito's communist regime. The United States honored a hero in silence, a medal unseen, recognition unacknowledged. It was not until 1967 that the award was made public, and Richard Feldman and other rescued airmen were able to attend a ceremony honoring Mihailović's legacy. 21 years after his unjust execution, the Serbian villages that had helped, the families that had risked everything, never received any official recognition or compensation from the American government. No thanks, no apology, no acknowledgement of their sacrifice. But they had never asked for anything in return. For them, it had been a matter of honor, a duty to help those in need, even strangers, even at the cost of their own lives. Justice came, in part, in 2015. Serbian courts annulled Mihailović's 1946 conviction, declaring the trial unfair and politically motivated, a communist show trial with a predetermined verdict. While the ruling stopped short of declaring his innocence of all charges, it acknowledged the injustice he had suffered. For those who knew the truth, it was a long overdue vindication. Mihailović was no criminal. He was a hero, murdered for saving Allied lives. Today, monuments stand in Serbia, in Prenjani, Boljanic, Kočevo, quiet tributes to Operation Halyard. They honor the villagers who built airstrips by hand, the Chetnik fighters who protected airmen, the OSS agents who led the mission, and the pilots who braved impossible conditions to bring men home. American veterans, now in their 90s, some in wheelchairs, still travel to Serbia to revisit the villages where they were hidden, to hug the grandchildren of the families who saved them, to cry and remember together. 75 years later, the bond between these men and the Serbian people remains unbroken. Gratitude, loyalty, and brotherhood, forged in the darkest days of war, have transcended time and borders. George Musulin returned to the United States after the war, continued his intelligence work, and never forgot Serbia. He died in 1987, buried with honors, his legacy etched in the 512 lives he helped save. Arthur Jabillion, the young radio operator who had guided planes through the darkness and kept critical communication lines open, returned to Ohio. He lived a quiet life, received the Silver Star for his bravery, and died in 2007, remembered as the hero who made the evacuation possible. George Vujnovich, the mastermind behind the mission, returned to New York and worked for airline companies. A mild-mannered businessman whose neighbors never knew he had organized the largest airman rescue in history. He never bragged, never sought attention. He died in 2012 at the age of 96, decorated with the Bronze Star and Legion of Merit, his heroism known only to those who understood the truth. And the 512 rescued airmen? They lived full lives, came home, raised families, built careers, and passed down the story of Operation Halyard to their children and grandchildren. Thousands of descendants exist today because Serbian villagers chose courage over fear, because American agents chose duty over safety, because Allied governments chose rescue over politics, at least for those 6 months. Operation Halyard remains largely forgotten. It is not taught in most schools, not mentioned in mainstream World War II histories, overshadowed by larger battles like D-Day and Stalingrad, by the drama of the atomic bomb. But to 512 men and their families, it was everything. Without Operation Halyard, those men would have died, captured, executed, lost to history. Their families would never have been born. Their legacies would have been erased. This is the story that must be remembered. Not just the military operation, not just the statistics, but the humanity at its core. Serbian families with nothing giving everything. American agents risking their lives to bring comrades home. Allied pilots landing in impossible conditions to save lives. Strangers bound by a shared commitment to doing what is right, even when it costs them everything. Operation Halyard was more than a rescue mission. It was a miracle of coordination, courage, and sacrifice. It was proof that even in the midst of war, of hatred, of destruction, of political betrayal, kindness and honor can prevail. It was the greatest rescue mission of World War II, a forgotten miracle, a story that must never be lost to history. If this story of courage and sacrifice has moved you, we'd be honored if you'd like this video and share it with someone who appreciates real history. These stories matter. These heroes deserve to be remembered. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next documentary about the untold stories of World War II. Stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Stories that change history. In the comments, tell us, do you have family members who served in World War II? Do you know anyone who was part of Operation Halyard? We'd love to hear their stories. Let's keep these memories alive together. Don't forget to like, subscribe to my channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any exciting war history content. Thank you all for watching till the end. Every like and comment is my greatest support. We'll see you next time. Bye.